I'd read somewhere that polar bears had the strongest sense of smell of any mammal. And there I am, sort of tearing open this steaming bag of, really strong fishy bait,
I'm very excited to be joined now by Ben Saunders, who is one of the leading polar explorers, a record-breaking long-distance skier who's covered more than 7,000 kilometres on foot in the polar region since 2001. His accomplishments include skiing solo to both the North and South Poles and leading the Scott Expedition, the longest human-powered polar journey in history. Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
It's fantastic. So firstly, I wanted to ask you about the description I just gave of you. Would you classify yourself as an explorer?
Yeah, I still, I've been doing this for nearly 20 years now, a dozen big expeditions. And I still struggle to know how to introduce myself. I mean, explorer probably makes the most sense, but it always sounds a bit grand. I always think it's like being in the army and calling yourself a warrior. Someone else might call you that, but I wouldn't put it on a business card. So I still struggle. Long distance skier, who knows?
Well, I think all of the above, quite frankly. But I wanted to also ask you what attracted you to it, because it's a very niche specialism, I think.
Yeah, my careers advisor at school never mentioned polar explorer as an option, and it's been nearly 2 decades for me now, so it's worked out okay in the end. I think initially, even as a young boy, I was lucky enough to grow up in the West Country, Devon, Somerset. I was outdoors a lot. I was classic, sort of bright but idle pupil. I'm old enough that ADHD didn't really exist as a diagnosis when I was a schoolboy, but I suspect I would have been prime candidate. So I always struggled, being confined to the four walls of a classroom, but loved being outdoors. Just loved it. That's where I sort of came alive, and that's where all the exciting stuff happened. And I was in the Scouts, loved camping, loved going walking on Dartmoor and Exmoor. I'm not quite sure where the screw came loose completely, but I blame it mostly on a guy called John Ridgway, who is in his 80s now. I haven't spoken to him for years, but he was an extraordinary character, sort of ex-SAS, used to box for Great Britain. He was, in 1966, along with Che Blythe, they became the first people to cross the Atlantic in a rowing boat. And a proper, the sort of thing you'd rent on the Serpentine, a literally open wooden boat with 2 beds. 93 days in this boat. He came back, got some land up in the Scottish Highlands, middle of nowhere, and established, I think at some point in the 70s before I was born, what he called the John Ridgway School of Adventure. And I wangled a job working for him for the best part of a year. In my late teens, what should have been a gap year after A levels, and I'm still on it now. I never made it to further education, but that was a kind of seminal year for me, because he was an extraordinary, very inspiring guy to be around and to be working for and working with. I think even at primary school as a kid, like, snow was the most exciting weather normally, because it meant a day off school if it snowed enough. So there was always this subconscious connection with excitement and the cold. Beyond that, I'm not really sure. I think for me, these big expeditions, in some way, that they are, in terms of the climate that I'm operating in, it's about as extreme as you can get on the surface of the Earth without leaving the atmosphere. So part of me wonders if I'm a sort of frustrated astronaut. I was inspired as a young boy by Star Wars as much as I was by Shackleton. I secretly sort of had this yearning to be a astronaut one day. That obviously didn't happen, but this is about the closest I've got.
Amazing. And then how do you prepare for your expeditions? Is it different every time, or is there a routine you get into?
Yeah, in many ways there's a bit of a routine. Obviously they're big physical challenges, and the peculiar physical challenges, because you have to be a jack of all trades. In some ways they're sort of ultra endurance. My biggest expedition was 1,800 miles, so that's 69 marathons back to back. But they're also a bit like a strongman event, because you're wearing a harness, dragging this sledge that's got everything you need, mostly food. We had 2 of us in Antarctica, 3.5 months, 108 days of food in the sledge. So that was 200 kilos each, 440 pounds. So basically the same as 2 pretty large men in a bathtub each that we're dragging behind us. So the sort of physical fitness is an interesting challenge, and I guess those big trips have had about a year, 18 months of sort of training towards them. But in other ways, they're vastly complex projects to organize. You know, everything from the logistics to finding the right thermal underwear and everything in between. I'm convinced I've spent more time in Excel spreadsheets than I have actually on skis. That's the less glamorous side. There's a lot of planning, a lot of work that goes into the background, and of course they are peculiarly expensive camping trips. My biggest expedition in 2013, we called it the Scott expedition because we basically finished the expedition that Captain Scott died trying to achieve. That all in, we spent about 1.7 million pounds. So huge project, you know, team of 12 people in the background, sort of mission control. So it became, you know, I inadvertently became the CEO of this weird business where I was sort of leading the team, but I was also the product. I was the thing that we were delivering for the sponsors. So there's juggling all sorts of things to get these big trips off the ground. And in many ways, dragging a sledge at -40 is the easiest, simplest part. That's the sort of reward for finally getting all the groundwork done.
So with an expedition like the Scott one that you did you feel, was there a historical weight when, as well, in addition to everything? Did you find yourself cross-referencing with the experiences he'd had, or did you feel closer to him in any way? How was it?
It's interesting. I before we left for Antarctica, I was adamant that this wasn't going to be a sort of backward-looking historical kind of reenactment. I wanted it to be progressive and high tech and 21st century. We had, you know, cutting edge satellite communications. We had hundreds of schools following our progress on the website every day. They could ask questions on the website. We could answer them the next day. So we had this extraordinary level of our ability to communicate and our ability to share the story in real time. So initially, I was really wary of sort of getting too involved. And Scott and Shackleton, they're still sort of divisive character. I mean, there've been dozens of biographies of both of them, and still now people are like, oh, who's your favorite? Who would you pick to go with? Scott or Shackleton? And in a way, I started to feel a little bit more sympathetic to Scott, who didn't have the luxury, as Shackleton did, of sort of telling his own story. You know, Scott's diary was literally prized out of the frozen pocket, you know, from when his body was found in his tent and was published. So I sort of feel, you know, in some ways, I thought that literally walking in their footsteps with ski tracks for the first time, no one had done that before. Walking, you know, from the coast to the pole, back to the coast again, would give Taka, my teammate, and I some unique insights into what it must have been like for them. And in some ways, it perhaps did, but in other ways, I've just come away with my mind blown, you know, even more at the level of sort of risk and commitment. And for us, the flip side of having this extraordinary, you know, satellite communication and aircraft, we were never technically beyond reach of being rescued. It might have taken a few days if the weather was bad and we were a long way from anywhere. But we were never, you know, rescue was always an option for us, and therefore giving up was always an option for us. It was only one phone call away. And of course, Scott Shackleton didn't, you know, people often say, well, what do you think it was that kept them going? Well, they had no choice. It was just keep moving or die, basically. So yeah, in a way now, it sort of occurred to me that there are interesting parallels with those genuinely pioneering Edwardian endeavors, and the idea of people flying to Mars in a few years' time or a decade's time or whatever it might be. You know, Scott Shackleton were sailing away from home, often for 3 years at a time, with no communication, no hope of being rescued if anything went wrong, and in the early days, no idea what lay beyond the horizon. You know, they knew Antarctica was vast. It's the size of China and India put together. So it's a giant continent, but no idea what was in the middle. Someone thought there might be another ocean. Someone else thought had this theory there was a hole that extended to the center of the Earth. So they were genuine journeys into the unknown. And I think having done what I've done, I've just got just an even higher level of appreciation and respect for the risk that they took.
So you touched briefly on the fact that help was only a couple of days away at the worst. How important is it for you on an expedition to have that contact with the outside world? You're known for your social media presence and for blogging and your contact. Is that something that you could do without, or is it emotionally important to you?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I'm a bit of a geek deep down. I have this sort of explorer geek alter ego thing going on, and for me the internet has become just the most unique, extraordinary way to as someone who grew up inspired by reading about these people in books, from the library or borrowing or in National Geographic or whatever it was. The ability to sort of share the story in real time, and not only to share it, but to enable people to interact with it and to ask us questions as we're skiing along was really magical. And I think people often assume it must have sort of added to our workload, the idea that after 10 hours dragging a sledge and we've got to melt snow to make our food and it's -30, I've then got to update the website. God, that must be a pain. And actually, I really look forward to it. And I'm currently in lockdown, not making great progress on my book because, like all of us, I've just found myself sort of in back-to-back Zoom calls and suddenly busy with DIY projects and all sorts of ways to procrastinate. But I still haven't written my book yet, and it's become a very long and laboured process. But actually, if I look at the blog, from that expedition alone, I wrote 70,000 words. I mean, that's nearly a book, just from a little bit every night in the tent. And it was a real highlight because I had all day skiing along, not much going on normally. There's a lot of drudgery and not much adrenaline to think about what I was going to write that evening. So in some ways, I've loved the ability to communicate in this sort of 21st century fashion. In other ways, it's a double-edged sword. And I skied solo to the North Pole in 2004, so that was 10 weeks, 72 days on my own. And the North Pole is peculiar because it's in the middle of the sea. If you're daft enough to walk there, you're walking over the frozen surface or semi-frozen surface of the Arctic Ocean. So there are no maps. You're walking over the frozen surface of the sea. It's an environment that is sort of shifting and changing and literally drifting. I would wake up every morning somewhere different to where I went to sleep the night before, drifting around on the sea ice. So it was, in many ways, a magical trip. In other ways, pretty scary. I was 26. I put a tripwire around the tent at night with these sort of flares that would go off in case a polar bear came along and wanted to come and have a little, sniff or chew on my tent. Yeah, exactly. So it was a sort of high stress, high stakes environment. And I had a satellite phone, 26 years old, and I sort of promised my mum that I'd check in every few days and give her a ring. And I suddenly realized I had to be really careful how I communicated. I remember one night, just sort of unusually windy and stormy, and it's very noisy in the tent. If it's windy, it's flapping around. I couldn't hear anything, and I had my evening meal was sort of freeze dried in a bag. So I'd melt snow to get hot water, pour that in the bag, eat it out of the bag, and they were Norwegian. It's a Norwegian brand, and one of them was some sort of cod, fish stew that was delicious, but smelt really fishy. And I remember sort of logged in my brain was the fact that I'd read somewhere that polar bears had the strongest sense of smell of any mammal. And there I am, sort of tearing open this steaming bag of really strong fishy bait, and I sort of had my meal and just sort of packed everything away and lay back in my sleeping bag in the tent, and I had to call my mum, and I remember thinking, God, how am I going to do this? And I was lying there just before I dull numb. I was convinced that I could hear sort of big footsteps crumpling through the snow, and I was lying there still, like trying to, is this a bear or something? I was just imagining things. And then I called my mum, and I remember thinking, God, what am I going to do here? Mum, I'm feeling a bit scared. It's week 6 or whatever on my own. The weather's really bad. I'm lying still in my tent, but my GPS tells me I'm moving because the ice is drifting with this storm. I think I can hear a polar bear outside. What do you think I should do, Mum? So there's potential. Yes, in some ways it's wonderful to have that communication, but in other ways it's very easy to get other people worrying even more than they already are. And it can also, in my experience, really exacerbate homesickness as well. If it is a solo trip and you are feeling a bit sorry for yourself, it really makes things better, to be able to talk to loved ones.
Yeah. So you have to finish the story. What happened? Was there a polar bear?
No, there wasn't. Well, maybe I did occasionally. I sort of wake up and see footprints pretty close to the tent, and I often wonder on that trip, 10 weeks out there, how many bears saw me that I never spotted. My sort of head down in my sledge harness.
And then, do you prefer traveling by yourself? Is a solo expedition? I mean, obviously there are different challenges, but do you prefer challenging just by yourself or with a team?
Yeah, I think for me, initially the idea of attempting a solo expedition, and I've done obviously both the North and South Poles on my own now, so I've spent weeks and weeks on my own in the most remote places on the planet. Initially, that didn't spring from the fact that I'm some sort of sociopathic, raving loner. It was I don't think it was more that to me it seemed like the ultimate level of challenge, the ultimate in this bizarre niche that I was slowly specializing in. It just seemed like the sort of highest rung of the ladder, the sort of most challenging thing I could aspire to. So that was the interest in it, and in some ways it's got a surprising amount going for it. Traveling on your own, in that as soon as there are two or more of you, as soon as it becomes a team, you have to agree a routine, that you have to impose some kind of mutually agreed schedule, right? We're going to wake up at 6, we'll start skiing at 8, we'll do X 9 hours, 10 hours, whatever, we'll stop at blah, we'll stop and eat every 90 minutes. When you're on your own, you can kind of live to your own routine. So there's this wonderful amount of freedom. And one of the paradoxes of these big expeditions in the largest wildernesses on Earth is that if you're with a team, invariably you're spending half the time living in a space that it would be illegal to keep prisoners in. So you're in this tiny tent half the time, and there very quickly there becomes this sort of division down the middle of the tent. So you have your side of the tent, and woe betide your teammate sort of accidentally leans across and puts his sweaty sock on your sleeping bag, or whatever it is. So it's a stressful environment in which to sort of cohabit with someone else, and of course on your own you do what you like. You can sleep in the starfish position, you can just whatever. So there's a lot of freedom with traveling solo, and part of me I think has sort of relished that. The downside is that I've genuinely never felt lonely on these long trips, normally because you are so busy. Like you have to do everything. If there are two of you, you take it in turns to cook dinner and melt the snow, and take in turns to navigate. You can follow their tracks half the day and daydream. If it's just you've got to be on it the whole time. You're always navigating, timekeeping, looking at the weather, trying to pick the best route. As soon as you stop, you've got to put the tent up, you've got to melt the snow, you've got to cook, you've got to update the website. There's no one to sort of share the tasks with. So as a result, your mind is occupied the whole time. And when you might think that traveling solo would be the most amazing opportunity to sort of meditate and reflect and think deeply, that in my experience that hasn't really happened. I've always just been really stressed out and busy the whole time. And actually, when there are two of you and you're following them, every other hour, whatever it is, then you can switch off and daydream. So the quality of thought actually, for me, is better when there's more than one of you. The biggest downside, I think, to being solo is the fact that there's no one sharing that experience with you. And in these magical places I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time in, particularly Antarctica and the high Arctic, they're both extraordinary. But the magic with the North Pole is that it's always changing. So for 10 weeks on my own, I saw scenery, stunning icescapes that no one else has ever seen before, because the ice is always changing, and that no one else will ever see ever again. And my vocabulary feels utterly stunted trying to explain what it was like if people have never been to those sorts of places. So if you're with someone else or with a team, you end up with this incredible bond that you've both lived through something properly challenging together. Doing things solo, it end up being really, really frustrating because nobody shared it with you. Nobody else could ever know what it was like.
So has it prepared you mentally for lockdown at all? Having to get into routines and not necessarily be going out all the time if it's stormy and that kind of.
Yeah, in some ways, I've lost track of what week we're on now, but it's the novelty is starting to wear off. I think initially I was sort of guiltily quite enjoying it in that my life, pre-pandemic was always seemed to be one extreme or the other. I was either away on big expeditions or working, last season in Antarctica, or I was flying around giving talks, which is a big part of how I've sort of made a living, this bizarre career. So I spent a lot of last year in hotels all around the world, way too much flying, way too many miles on my wheelie bag through airport terminals. So I've actually really enjoyed, certainly the first couple of weeks at home for the first time in ages. I got married in 2018. I think this is a record time that my wife and I have actually been
Like
together.
honeymoon.
So yeah, I getting vaguely itchy feet now, but in some ways, I think it's been really good preparation, mentally, emotionally, in that invariably on these big expeditions, I'm trying to get something done, trying to reach some goal, arbitrary goal that I've, might be a point, North Pole, South Pole, whatever it is. But there's invariably a target, invariably some challenging, ambitious thing that I'm trying to do. But I'm also in an environment that is totally outside my control, and where these giant, all-powerful natural forces that I'm completely at the mercy of,
and it's
dictate often.
Of the, when you were talking about the North Pole and the monotony of just ice every day, I did make me think a little bit of lockdown.
Yes, there's a lot of sort of, I think it helps to have a sort of a kind of goldfish memory, which I probably do, and just sort of wake up, oh, another day, great. But I think for me, that one of the big lessons very quickly was that in some ways these big journeys are all about efficiency, about conserving your energy and sort of applying it to the things that are within your control. And for me, that might just be moving one foot in front of the other and heading in the right direction. But I learned quickly that sort of getting stressed or angry or worried or anxious about things that I couldn't change, which for me is the weather, the temperature, the wind, the visibility, all of these things, was a waste of the very finite amount of energy that I had and that I was trying to conserve. And you become very aware of it because you're literally dragging a sledge full of food, and you have a certain amount of calories per day. You're sort of losing weight as the trip goes on, becoming more and more exhausted. So you become very aware of sort of shepherding your energy. And I think that to me is the most important lesson now. It's very easy to be addicted to the news headlines or Twitter or whatever it is, and there's so much sort of anxiety porn out there right now. It's so easy to fall in this trap, like, oh, it's all out of control, politics is a mess, but we can't really change any of those things. So I think for me that the important lesson has been about focus, I guess, and where we apply the energy that we all have.
And then tell me about White Desert, because I think that sounds really exciting. You'll be much better at telling everyone about it than I am. So
so I was back in Antarctica at the end of last year. So the Antarctic season is effectively the summer, but it's southern hemisphere. So the season really runs from November through till February. And years and years and years ago, I met a guy called Patrick Woodhead, who is now the founder and the CEO of White Desert. White Desert are an extraordinary, pretty unique business. It's a British company, but they operate out of Cape Town, and they take an unusual mixture of guests in and out of Antarctica. So they now have two camps. I mean, camp is a sort of understatement. They're an extraordinary. They're pretty luxurious, and it's a dozen people at a time, small groups, and you fly from Cape Town into White Desert, have their own runway on a glacier in Antarctica. It's an extraordinary setup, and the business is growing quickly, partly because the runway is that they have and that they operate is an extraordinary asset that means they can now start not only flying clients in and out, but also supporting a huge number of scientists working in Antarctica. So the sort of client mix is invariably wealthy private clients, because Antarctica is an expensive place to visit. And I told you I spent 1.7 million quid on an expedition down there. So just the complexity of the logistics in such a remote, such a challenging place mean it's just never going to be a sort of mass market destination for a budget holiday. It's always going to be a lot of money to get there. So you've got sort of peculiar mixture of invariably wealthy clients and then scientists. And so I got involved with business last year and was based between Cape Town and Antarctica last season. And a few friends said, well, haven't you completely sold out? And as someone who cares deeply about, particularly about these environments at the highest latitudes, what the hell are you doing getting involved with a business that is all about aviation and a private jet? Well, it turns out that the jet they use is brand spanking new. It is the most efficient way of getting human beings in terms of CO2 per head in and out of Antarctica. And secondly, to me, there's this sentiment kind of grew for me as the season went on, as I met more and more clients that we were looking after down there. It can't, time in Antarctica can't help but be a sort of a transformation experience. It's just such a unique, such an inspiring place. And I think the ability to inspire, perhaps to educate, people who are captains of industry, founded or often run big businesses, or they're often already major philanthropists and donors. I think that the chance for them to experience Antarctica at first hand invariably changes their thinking, hopefully their behavior. So I think there's actually a real value to it as well. And we really encourage people to properly disconnect, and the ability, especially nowadays when we're all sort of bombarded the whole time by stimulus and sort of requests for things and other people's agendas, the ability to sort of completely switch that off and to be in a place that is just so naturally, physically impressive and inspiring to me is magical.
One last question. Where's next for you? What's your next challenge?
Gosh, where's next? Well, it kind of remains to be seen when and where we're allowed to travel. Yeah, I mean, the supermarket this afternoon is my next expedition with a bit of trepidation, a bit of everyone's kind of avoiding each other. But yeah, beyond that, hopefully back to Antarctica end of this year with White Desert. One of the plans I'm sort of loosely working on is putting together a team of sort of half young people, students with different areas of expertise. So like a young scientist, a young artist, a young writer, a young filmmaker, match them all with amazing mentors and take them all to Antarctica for a week or two, and sort of for the trip to be all about storytelling. And it's taken me a while to realize that there's a lot of data coming out of Antarctica and the climate science that's being done down there, but nothing's really changing. And of course, humans, we're kind of narrative beings. We're not inspired by data, we're inspired by stories. So for me, part of the next chapter, the next adventure is around, I guess, kind of enabling a new generation of storytellers, to kind of visit Antarctica and try and explain what they experienced through their own eyes. And
what sort of age are you thinking for that?
Yeah, loosely late teens, early 20s.
And how will they find out about it?
Yeah, well, I haven't. Gosh, I mean, this is yeah. You heard it here first. There will be a website. The best thing, you said I'm on social media, so keep an eye on that, and all will be revealed later this year.
Well, good luck with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Real pleasure.